I caught the attention of the richest man, and became his 10th girlfriend. Everyone online was speculating about when I'd be dumped, but a month later, a video of the billionaire tearfully calling me wife was uploaded online. I became a trending topic. The whole internet was waiting for me to become a joke. Because today was the day billionaire Quincy Masefield was supposed to dump me. Everyone knows that Quincy Masefield's relationships never last more than 7 days. And today marked the 7th day of mine with him. Sitting here waiting for Edith Bill to get dumped. Edith Bill has neither the looks nor the figure. No wonder she's getting dumped. Hearing these comments, I smiled and nudged the man beside me, raising an eyebrow. So, I heard you're planning to break up with me. As soon as I finished speaking, I was suddenly pulled closer by a strong force around my waist. Quincy Masefield, with his captivating eyes, looked at me and smiled faintly. Oh, you don't want me anymore. His deep, magnetic voice whispered softly in my ear. I looked up, and Quincy Masefield's mesmerizing, beautiful face came into view. In that instant, I suddenly recalled what people said about him online. Handsome, wealthy, domineering, heartless. They say Quincy Masefield has never truly loved anyone. The women around him were just temporary distractions to relieve his boredom. He could be so ruthless that he'd be calling someone his buddy one moment, and sending them to jail the next. But he's also very generous. Every time he breaks up with someone, he gives them $1 million severance package. To be honest, I was kind of looking forward to that $1 million. Tonight, there's a banquet. I've got a surprise for you. Quincy Masefield smiled, handing me a gold-embossed invitation with his long fingers. I glanced up at him. A surprise. He smiled, his lips curving slightly. A big surprise. I looked at the invitation in his hand, then back at him. Oh, could it be a breakup party? If so, it means my $1 million is finally on the way. At the banquet hosted by Quincy Masefield, all of high society's elites were in attendance. Wearing the black dress Quincy had prepared for me, I turned around and came face to face with his ex, Virginia Carey. The current girlfriend meets the ex. I instantly became the focus of the event. Everyone's eyes turned toward us. Look, look, Edith Bill is going head to head with Virginia Carey. This is going to be good. Are they going to fight? But to everyone's disappointment, the next second, Virginia Carey excitedly rushed forward and hugged me. Sis, congratulations on getting rich. I patted her on the shoulder, smiling brightly. Congratulations to you too. I really was about to get rich. The thought of $1 million in my account tonight made me feel a little excited. The other guests, however, were dumbfounded. Why didn't they fight? And instead they hugged. Virginia and I exchanged a knowing smile. They didn't know that I'd already become close friends with all of Quincy Masefield's 9 exes. They also didn't know that we even had a private group chat. The group name, Ex-Girlfriend Alliance. Today, the group was particularly lively. Ex-Girlfriend A, congrats Edith Bill on getting rich overnight. Ex-Girlfriend B, congrats Edith Bill on escaping misery. Ex-Girlfriend C, congrats Edith Bill for no longer being a stand-in. I smiled brightly. Quincy Masefield had a secret about his long-lost love. I once saw a portrait in Quincy Masefield's study. In the painting was a young girl, probably no older than her teens, but exceptionally beautiful. Quincy cherished the painting deeply, never allowing anyone near it. None of his previous 9 girlfriends had even seen it. When I first saw the painting, I was startled, not because the girl was beautiful, but because I looked a lot like her. So much so that even the tear-shaped beauty mark under her eye matched mine. But I knew I wasn't her. I realized then that every one of Quincy's girlfriends bore some resemblance to this girl, but I was the one who looked the most like her. Quincy often complimented my beauty, and I admit, I am quite pretty, but I'm not stupid. I'd often catch him staring blankly at the beauty mark under my eye. It wasn't until I saw that painting that I understood he was seeing someone else through me. But after tonight, I wouldn't have to be anyone's stand-in anymore. I'd always been obedient, and Quincy had always been generous. I had already thought about how I'd spend that $1 million. Just then, a commotion arose at the entrance. A woman in a white dress entered gracefully. Tess Bunyan is here. No wonder she's the eldest daughter of the Bunyan family. She's stunning. Tess Bunyan has returned after studying abroad. and now she'll be a real contender in the socialite circles. If you ask me, Tess Bunyan and Quincy Masefield are the perfect match. Wait, doesn't anyone notice that Tess Bunyan looks a lot like Edith Bill? As soon as those words were spoken, Evrion's eyes turned toward me. I smiled and slowly raised my head, meeting Tess Bunyan's curious gaze. Tess Bunyan, the eldest daughter of the Bunyan family. She looked about 70% like me. Oh no, could Edith Bill be Tess Bunyan's stand-in? Someone in the banquet hall suddenly screamed, and the whole room erupted in chaos. No wonder Quincy Masefield chose Edith Bill, it's because of Tess Bunyan. Ha ha, Edith Bill is just a cheap imitation. How does she even have the nerve to show up in front of the real deal? Exactly. Today is the party Quincy Masefield threw especially for Tess Bunyan's return. Edith Bill is just a joke here. The insulting whispers reached my ears. Everyone was throwing disdainful and mocking looks my way. Virginia stomped her foot angrily. They've gone too far. I smiled and patted her on the shoulder to calm her down. It doesn't matter. The only thing I cared about was whether I'd get my $1 million. Nothing else mattered. Tess Bunyan, who was being admired by everyone, kept glancing at me. I smiled lazily, turned around, and casually picked up a piece of chocolate cake to eat. At Quincy Masefield's banquet, everything had to be the best. It'd be a waste not to enjoy it. Are you Edith Bill? A cold voice came from behind. I slowly turned around and saw Tess Bunyan in her white dress standing there. Her eyes were filled with curiosity, along with a faint hint of hostility. Tess, why bother talking to her? Yeah, she's such a lowly person. She doesn't even deserve to speak to you. The women beside Tess Bunyan were eager to please her, all while belittling me. Edith Bill, you'd better leave Quincy Masefield. Someone like you isn't worthy of being with Quincy Masefield. Tess Bunyan stood there, letting them hurl insults at me, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I smiled lightly. If I'm not worthy of Quincy Masefield, then are you? Tess Bunyan frowned, clearly not expecting me to talk back. Her two lackeys turned red with anger. Someone like Quincy Masefield, a man of his status, is only suited to someone like Tess Bunyan? Exactly. Tess Bunyan studied abroad at the best universities, and is highly sought after by top companies. Meanwhile, you're just a cheap imitation of her. You don't even compare. Tess Bunyan's frown slowly relaxed as she heard their words. She cast me a disdainful glance. It's important to know your place. Know my place. Heh. I laughed. I laughed so hard I doubled over. What's so funny? Tess Bunyan's lackey couldn't take it any longer, and stepped forward, raising her hand to slap me. And Tess Bunyan didn't even try to stop her. She just stood there, watching coldly, clearly approving of it. My eyes turned cold as I reached out and grabbed the lackey's wrist. I looked her in the eyes and said coldly, "What gives you the right to hit me?" It hurts. You wretch, let go of me." Tess Bunyan's lackey cried out in pain, her voice filled with agony. I sneered, "You think you're less despicable than a sycophant?" She froze in shock, her face turning pale as she stared at me, momentarily speechless. It seemed Tess Bunyan and her crew never expected me to fight back. They all looked at me in astonishment, especially Tess Bunyan. Her expression darkened as she regarded me with cold, assessing eyes. I shot her a glance, a cold smile playing on my lips. I've always believed that as long as people leave me alone, I don't bother them. I don't seek trouble. But if someone crosses me, I won't stand idly by and take the insult. Edith Bill, release Jody Strong, and I'll have her apologize to you," Tess Bunyan said icily. Tess Bunyan. Jody Strong, still caught in my grasp, looked at her in shock. I don't want my welcome party ruined. Tess glanced at her briefly, a hint of warning in her eyes. Jody Strong shuddered, pursing her lips before giving a reluctant nod. "Sorry," she muttered, begrudgingly. I smirked coldly. Tess Bunyan's welcome party. Quincy Masefield had gone on and on about tonight's event, urging me to dress up for it, saying he had a surprise for me. Is this what he meant by a surprise? I glanced at Tess Bunyan again before releasing my grip. Hitting her would only dirty my hands. Quincy Masefield is here. Quincy Masefield is here. The excited murmurs directed Evrion's attention toward the entrance. Quincy Masefield, dressed in a sleek black tailored suit, was walking in slowly. He must be here for Tess Bunyan. Of course, This welcome party was arranged by Quincy Masefield for Tess Bunyan. Yeah, let's see how long Edith Bill can stay smug. She'll be dumped soon. Just wait. Tess Bunyan's eyes lit up, a faint blush of excitement spreading across her face. Those around Tess began congratulating her, throwing more insults my way. I lazily lifted my gaze, looking at Quincy Masefield amidst all the attention. He usually lounges at home in casual clothes, leaning against my shoulder like a lazy cat. This was the first time I'd seen him so formally dressed. As he walked closer, Tess Bunyan's smile grew wider. I smiled faintly and turned, planning to leave. Suddenly, I felt an arm wrap around my waist, and a deep, magnetic voice whispered near my ear, "My dear Edith Bill, where do you think you're going?" I looked up, and there he was, Quincy Masefield, his flawless face inches from mine, smiling as he gazed at me intently. "So naughty. Didn't I tell you to wait for me at the party?" Quincy Masefield pulled me into his arms, his voice impossibly gentle. I glanced at the ashen-faced Tess Bunyan and smiled, hooking my arms around his neck. "I was getting bored without you." Quincy smiled, playfully tapping my nose. "All right, I'll stay with you now." Everyone stared, utterly dumbfounded. What's going on? Wasn't Quincy Masefield supposed to dump Edith Bill tonight? Yeah, this doesn't look like it at all. Wasn't Edith just a stand-in for Tess Bunyan? And isn't this party supposed to be Tess Bunyan's welcome celebration? As the murmurs spread, all eyes turned to Tess Bunyan. Tess Bunyan, with practiced grace, walked confidently toward Quincy Masefield. "Quincy Masefield, I'm back," she said with a poised smile, radiating the demeanor of a refined lady. Quincy Masefield, still holding me close, lazily turned to glance at her. All he said was a dismissive, "HMM." His tone was utterly indifferent. Tess' smile faltered, her fists clenching slightly even as she forced herself to maintain a composed expression. "Thank you, Quincy Masefield, for throwing me this welcome party," she said, casting a triumphant look in my direction, as if to say, "You're just a substitute. I'm the real deal." "Who said this party was for you?" The cold, biting voice that filled the hall sent a wave of shock through everyone. Quincy Masefield's gaze swept over Tess Bunyan with a warning gleam. Tess' pupils shrank, and her smile finally crumbled. "Quincy Masefield," ignoring her completely. Quincy Masefield held me tighter and glanced at the crowd. He spoke slowly. "Thank you all for coming to celebrate the 1-week anniversary of me and Edith Bill." He looked down at me, his eyes filled with tenderness. "Let me formally introduce you, Edith Bill, my girlfriend." I blinked, surprised by this unexpected move. So this party was for me. Everyone around us exchanged bewildered glances. "What's happening? Quincy Masefield didn't break up with Edith Bill, and he's actually making her his official girlfriend. That can't be right. Quincy's girlfriends never last more than 7 days. Tess Bunyan must be mortified. She thought this was her welcome party, but it's actually for Edith Bill." Tess Bunyan's face was pale with disbelief, her lips trembling as she stared sorrowfully at Quincy Masefield. He didn't spare her a single glance. Instead, he turned to me, his lips curving into a soft smile. "Girlfriend, would you honor me with a dance?" I looked briefly at Tess Bunyan and saw her glaring at me, with barely concealed hostility. I raised my brows and smiled. "Sure." Tess Bunyan and her minions stood awkwardly, caught in an embarrassing predicament. Quincy Masefield tightened his hold on me slightly, his voice holding a trace of playful grievance. "Are they more interesting than me?" I chuckled, wrapping my arms around him. "Of course not." Only then did he smile in satisfaction, leaning close to whisper in my ear, "So, my dear, are you happy with this surprise?" I paused. Surprise? Heh. Honestly, I was still a little bitter about the $1 million I spent, but humiliating Tess Bunyan and her crew made it all worth it. I smiled and gave him a quick kiss on the cheek. "Very happy." Quincy Masefield's gaze darkened slightly as he pulled me closer with a smile. "Quincy Masefield, are you still mad at me for leaving without a word all those years ago? Is that why you brought her here, to get back at me?" A sorrowful voice suddenly called out from behind us. Quincy Masefield frowned in irritation, shooting an icy look over his shoulder. Tess Bunyan stood there, biting her lip, her face twisted in anguish as she looked at him. I raised a brow at Quincy. "Should I step away?" He held me tighter. "No need." Tess Bunyan's face paled even further. She probably hadn't expected Quincy Maysfield to give her no face at all, despite her efforts to lower herself. Quincy Maysfield, Tess Bunyan, I've been looking for you, came a soft, feminine voice from behind. I looked up and saw a middle-aged woman, graceful in her stance, standing a short distance away. Her features bore a striking resemblance to Tess Bunyan's. Her eyes, however, were fixed firmly on me. Mom. Seeing her, Tess' composure crumbled as she threw herself into the woman's arms. Looking pitiful, the woman embraced her, a trace of pain flashing through her gaze. I glanced at her indifferently. It was Doris Hornby, Tess Bunyan's mother, the formidable businesswoman with a reputation for ruthlessness. Now, it seemed she was here to back her daughter. Doris Hornby gently patted Tess Bunyan's back before looking up at Quincy Maysfield with a soft smile. Quincy Maysfield, Tess Bunyan has caused you trouble. I apologize on her behalf. Quincy glanced at Tess in Doris' arms and replied bluntly, Indeed, she disturbed my girlfriend. Auntie, you should discipline her properly. Everyone around exchanged awkward glances. Even Doris froze momentarily, and Tess' eyes reddened, looking like she was about to cry. Doris quickly regained her composure and shifted her gaze to me, who was standing next to Quincy. She smiled. So this is Quincy Maysfield's girlfriend. I apologize on behalf of Tess Bunyan for her previous offenses. Her words were polite and courteous, leaving no room for criticism. I smiled faintly and said, Mrs. Bunyan, there's no need to be so formal, but children do need guidance. As parents, you can't shield them forever. Wouldn't you agree? I looked at her with a pleasant smile, while Doris paused slightly and then scrutinized me before returning my smile. You're right, Edith Bill. I'll make sure to discipline her properly. Tess glared at me angrily, wanting to speak, but Doris quickly pulled her back. With a brief glance at me and Quincy, she nodded and led Tess away. Quincy looked down at me with a smirk. Feeling better now, Edith? I looked up into his charming eyes and smiled softly. The satisfaction was undeniable, but the thought of the $1 million I'd lost still stung a little. Unsurprisingly, I ended up trending online again. Quincy Maysfield and Edith Bill. Edith Bill and Tess Bunyan. Quincy Maysfield's girlfriend. These topics dominated the trending lists. Even the Ex's Alliance group chat was blowing up with messages. XA, Edith Bill, you've made it big. XB, Edith, you're amazing. XC, I can't believe you snagged Quincy Maysfield. You're my idol. Virginia Carey, you guys don't know how satisfying it was when Edith Bill shut Tess Bunyan down. She totally stood up for all of us. I rubbed my temples and sent a reply, but my $1 million is gone. Virginia Carey, girl, look at the big picture. Do you really think the richest man will let you miss out on $1 million? Me, Ex's Alliance. A deep voice suddenly interrupted my thoughts. I trembled slightly, holding my phone. When I looked up, I met Quincy's amused gaze. Well, I blinked, trying to come up with an excuse. Just then, he handed me a bank card with his slender fingers. I was startled. What's this? Quincy curved his lips into a smile. A gift for our 1-week anniversary. There's 30 million in it. My eyes instantly lit up. 30 million. As expected of the richest man, so generous. Don't want it. He waved the card slightly, raising an eyebrow at me. I want it. Of course, I want it. Hesitating for even a second would be disrespecting $30 million. I quickly took the card from his hand, grinning brightly. Quincy chuckled and pulled me into his arms, lazily leaning against my shoulder. Little money grr. I looked down at the card and whispered, for many people, this amount could save their lives. Then, I looked up at him, smiling as I hooked my arm around his neck. Do you dislike me for being greedy? His eyes softened as he pulled me even closer. No matter who you are, I like every version of you. His deep voice wrapped around me, and I trembled slightly before smiling and hugging him tighter. Later, I received an invitation from Doris Hornby for a private meal. Quincy glanced at me, his eyes darkening. Are you sure you don't want me to go with you? I wrapped my arm around his and raised an eyebrow. Afraid I'll get bullied. Quincy looked down at me with a smile and gently patted my head. I'm here, so feel free to do whatever you want. I stood on my tiptoes and gave him a light kiss on the cheek, smiling. I'm going in. Quincy nodded. Watching as I walked away, I pushed open the door to the private room, where only Doris Hornby was waiting. She was elegantly dressed, and gracefully stood to greet me with a smile. Edith Bill, thank you for accepting my invitation. I sat down lazily, smiling back at her. How could I dare refuse Mrs. Bunyan's invitation? Doris' expression faltered slightly, but she maintained her smile as she sat down. Edith Bill, you look remarkably like someone I once knew. She studied my face as if searching for something. I smiled slightly. Just someone you knew. Then I looked up at her, my gaze turning cold. Doris' eyes widened in shock, and her smile faltered. Are you really Sophia? Sophia, I laughed. It had been so long since I heard that name. So long, in fact, that I had almost forgotten I was once called Sophia. Doris' expression changed dramatically as she muttered, I should have realized the moment I saw you. You look so much like me. How could you be anyone else? She stared at me blankly. Sophia, sorry, Mrs. Bunyan. My name is Edith Bill. I smiled at her, devoid of any emotion. Sophia, I'm your mother. Her face was filled with sorrow as she looked at me. You're still angry with me, aren't you? I smiled lightly. Mrs. Bunyan, you shouldn't claim family ties so carelessly. Doris trembled slightly, her face full of sadness. Sophia, I had no choice back then. Oh, really, no choice? I laughed coldly. Was your so-called no choice the fact that I was an obstacle to your marriage into a wealthy family? Is that why you did everything you could to abandon me, even watching as traffickers took me away without doing anything? I looked at her icily, speaking every word with precision. Doris' pupils shrank in horror as she stared at me. You know everything. I laughed, a laugh so bitter that tears almost came out. Yes, of course I knew. When the traffickers took me, I saw Doris hiding around the corner. She watched as I was taken away, without lifting a finger. From that moment, whatever bond we had as mother and daughter was severed. While I suffered in that dark cellar, starved and beaten, Doris donned a wedding dress, and married into the Bunyan family, becoming the wife of a wealthy household. How could I ever forgive her? Sophia, I really did try to find you. The moment you were taken, I regretted it. I called the police. I really did. But they couldn't find you. Doris' voice trembled as she covered her face in pain. I scoffed. And then what? You just went on to marry into the Bunyan family and became Mrs. Bunyan, right? Do you know, when I was forced to beg on the streets, the giant screen was broadcasting your wedding. When I was beaten almost to the point of disability, the media were all congratulating you on the birth of your little princess. Is that what you call regret? I glared at her icily. Doris' lips trembled, but she couldn't find the words to respond. With trembling hands, she pulled a bank card from her bag and handed it to me. Sophia, I know I wronged you. This is $1 million. I glanced at the card in her hand and laughed. How generous of Mrs. Bunyan. Is this hush money? Doris flinched. No. She clutched the card tightly before speaking slowly. Sophia, Tess Bunyan is your sister, and she likes Quincy Masefield. I laughed. So, it wasn't hush money after all. It was a bribe to get me to leave Quincy. I took the card from her hand with a smile. I'll take the money, but I'm not leaving Quincy Masefield. This money, it's the debt the Bunyan family owes. I stared coldly at her, watching as panic filled her eyes. I smiled, turned, and walked out. The debt the Bunyan family owes is far from being settled. As I stepped outside, I saw Quincy's tall figure waiting for me. He walked toward me and pulled me into his arms. Let's go home, his deep, magnetic voice whispered in my ear. His large hand enveloped mine, the warmth of his palm soothing me. I smiled softly and let him lead me away. Back home, Quincy stayed by my side, as if afraid I might do something rash. I laughed, throwing myself into his arms. What's wrong? No work today? Quincy glanced at me and raised an eyebrow. If I still had to go to the office every day, what's the point of paying so many people high salaries? Charity. I burst into laughter. He wasn't wrong. Oh, and this card, I said, handing him the one Doris gave me. Could you donate the money for me? Quincy took the card and glanced at it. Donate it. I looked at it indifferently. It feels dirty. Quincy chuckled softly. All right. I looked up at him, paused for a moment, and then asked, aren't you curious? Quincy gently ruffled my hair, his voice tender. When you're ready to tell me, you will. I froze for a moment, then smiled, slowly wrapping my arms around him. How did I get so lucky to have someone like Quincy Masefield in my life? That night, I received several threatening messages on my phone. Edith Bill, you're not good enough for Quincy Masefield. If you don't leave Quincy Masefield, the consequences will be unbearable for you. I glanced at the messages and smiled. Unbearable consequences. To be honest, I'm actually looking forward to seeing what they could be. Quincy Masefield pulled me into his arms, raising an eyebrow. What's making you smile like that? I put my phone away and raised my brow at him. You'll get to see a good show soon. Quincy paused, then said, just don't be too rough. I glanced at him sideways. Afraid I'll hurt your precious darling. He tapped my nose lightly, amused. I'm worried you'll hurt your hand. I laughed and nestled into his arms. The next day, while I was out shopping, a group of men cornered me in an alley. They looked at me with mockery in their eyes. Not bad. No wonder the richest man is so smitten by you. I glanced at them lazily and chuckled. Should I thank you for the compliment? The leader blinked, then laughed. You're quite something. Too bad someone wants me to teach you a lesson. Otherwise I might actually feel sorry. I lowered my eyes and smiled lightly. Before you teach me a lesson, could you tell me who sent you? The man squinted at me, about to speak. Edith Bill, you really are shameless, going after any man you can. A sneering voice suddenly rang out. I looked up and saw Tess Bunyan walking towards me, her face full of disdain. Edith Bill, didn't I warn you to stay away from Quincy Masefield? You didn't listen, so don't blame me now. She stood in front of me, mocking. I raised my eyes to glance at her, then smiled. What are you laughing at? Tess Bunyan's eyes grew cold, and her expression showed annoyance. At that moment, her face was full of jealousy, completely losing any trace of her upper-class elegance. I lazily lifted my gaze, looking at her with icy eyes. Tess Bunyan, do you think no one knows what you've done? Tess stiffened, her eyes filled with confusion as she looked at me. I stared at her coldly, speaking each word with clarity. A year ago, at the intersection, you hit a woman with your car. Tess' pupils shrank suddenly. How do you know? I scoffed. There's a saying, the only way to keep a secret is not to commit the act. Do you think fleeing abroad would keep you safe? Or did you believe the Bunyan family could cover everything up for you? Let me tell you, you committed a crime, and you will pay the price. Tess' eyes trembled slightly as she stared at me, squinting. How do you know? I looked at her coldly. The woman you hit was my mother. Back then, I escaped from human traffickers, and she kindly took me in. She was such a kind, gentle person, yet Tess Bunyan hit her, and left her in a coma. And Tess, the culprit, escaped abroad, living her life as the darling of the elite. Tess suddenly burst into wild laughter, completely unrestrained. So it was your low-life mother. Heh. No wonder, like mother, like daughter, both so disgusting. So what if you know the truth? What can you do about it? And after today, do you really think Quincy Masefield will still want you? She laughed mockingly, signaling the men behind her. The men slowly advanced toward me. I looked up at Tess Bunyan and smiled. Tess Bunyan, congratulations. You've just made yourself the laughingstock of the entire elite circle. With that, I raised my phone in the air. Tess' eyes darted toward my phone, and she suddenly froze. You wretch, what did you do? I smirked coldly. Oh, just making your crimes public. That's right, I had been live streaming. Tess didn't realize that she had just admitted her guilt in front of the entire internet. By now, it had probably already hit the top of the trending topics. Tess' face twisted in rage. You wretch, even if I go to hell, I'll drag you down with me. She turned to the men behind her and screamed, if you want money, get her now. The men hesitated briefly, exchanged glances, and rushed toward me. Edith Bill, you're finished. The whole internet will see you being ruined. Do you think Quincy Masefield will still want? Before Tess could finish her sentence, she froze. How is this possible? Just moments ago, the men had been swaggering forward, but now they were all writhing in pain on the ground. I lazily retracted my leg and dusted off my hands. It had been a while since I fought, I was a bit rusty. Tess stared at me in horror. How is this possible? How could you? I smiled faintly. Did Tess Bunyan think I was some delicate, helpless girl? Too bad for her. How could someone like me, who escaped from human traffickers, be weak? And on top of that, I've trained in Taekwondo for years. The men she hired weren't even a challenge. The sound of police sirens echoed in the distance. Soon, several officers arrived, arresting Tess Bunyan and the men on the ground. Tess glared at me like a madwoman. Edith Bill, you wait. When I get out, I won't let you go. I laughed loudly. Did Tess really think the Bunyan family could still save her? What a pity. The Bunyan family was probably too busy trying to save themselves. I picked up my phone from the ground, found a news article, and held it in front of her. Tess glanced at it, her pupils contracting in disbelief. How could the Bunyan family go bankrupt? I looked at her coldly. Did you think the things the Bunyan family did would stay hidden forever? The Bunyans made their fortune through shady dealings. Over the years, how many families had they destroyed? Did they really think there would be no consequences? I gave Tess one last look and sneered. Tess Bunyan, you were right about one thing. A wretch and her mother are truly despised by everyone. Tess shuddered, confused by my words. But I wasn't looking at her anymore. I was looking at the person standing behind her. Doris Hornby, pale as a ghost, stood there in silence. Mom, please save me. Tess turned, seeing Doris as her last hope, and cried out desperately. But Doris only looked at me with sorrow. Sophia, is this really what you wanted? For sisters to destroy each other, for family to turn against family. Sisters, family, Mom, what are you talking about? Tess looked bewildered by her mother's words. Doris sighed deeply. Tess Bunyan, you and she are sisters? What? Tess looked shocked, as if she had been struck. I glanced at Doris, my eyes cold. You're mistaken. My mother had only one child, me, and thanks to your precious daughter, my mother is still lying unconscious in the hospital. Doris trembled, her lips quivering, unable to speak. I no longer looked at her. Instead, I walked toward the figure standing at the end of the street. Quincy Maysfield was waiting there, smiling softly as he pulled me into his arms. You did great. It's all over now. I slowly raised my hand, wrapping my arms around him. Yes, it's over. The Bunyan family and Tess Bunyan were all sent to prison. Tess, once the darling of the social elite, had fallen from grace in the most spectacular way. She had become the public's enemy. I set my phone down and turned toward the person lying in the hospital bed. Mom, I've avenged you. Please wake up. But she remained silent, lying still. I sighed. It felt like Tess Bunyan had gotten off too easy. A pair of warm hands rested gently on my shoulders, a deep voice breaking the silence. Don't worry, I've hired the best doctors for her. She'll wake up. I turned around and saw Quincy Maysfield gazing at me, with nothing but tenderness. I smiled slightly. How did you know I'd be here? I had never told Quincy about my past or my mother, yet he knew everything. Quincy took my hand, lowered his eyes, and spoke softly. I was afraid you'd leave. I froze for a moment. I was afraid that after you'd finished what you came to do, you'd disappear. I was scared you'd leave my world, and I'd never see you again. Edith Bill, I was terrified you'd leave me. Quincy Maysfield pulled me closer, his eyes burning as he gazed at me. Will you leave? I looked at him, feeling a bit guilty. I had indeed thought about leaving after dealing with Tess Bunyan and the Bunyan family, taking my mom with me. But now, I looked up at him and smiled. Mr. Maysfield, are you confessing to me right now? Quincy's eyes lit up, full of hope. If I am, will you stay? I smiled softly. I will. Quincy's eyes tightened slightly as he pulled out a small box from his pocket, opening it gently. Inside was a delicate ring. Edith Bill, will you marry me? Quincy gazed at me lovingly, his eyes filled with anticipation. I glanced at him, lips curling into a smile. I'm quite greedy, you know. Aren't you afraid I'll run off with all your money? If you're greedy, that's even better. The one thing I have plenty of is money. Take as much as you want. Everything I have is yours. I am yours. Quincy's eyes sparkled with amusement as he pulled me into his embrace. So, Edith Bill, will you marry me? I leaned in closer, whispering softly in his ear. I will. Quincy's body trembled slightly, and then he held me tightly, he whispered tenderly. "I've finally won my favorite Edith Bill." I chuckled softly. I'd found the person I wanted to spend the rest of my life with too. This man is still the richest person in the world. I guess I've hit the jackpot. 1 week later, the billionaire's grand wedding. He threw a feast for 3 days and nights. He said he wanted everyone to know that he married the girl he loves the most. My group chat, previously named X Alliance, is now renamed Getting Rich Chat. Everyone in the group congratulated me on my overnight wealth. I raised an eyebrow. "You guys teamed up with Quincy Masefield to trick me, and I haven't even called you out yet." The group suddenly went silent. Virginia Carey, haha, "We were just trying to help you fulfill your dream of becoming a wealthy woman." I chuckled. It wasn't until later that I found out Virginia Carey and the others weren't actually Quincy Masefield's girlfriends. They were just his sponsored companions. Laughing, I sent a few big red packets to the group. "Let's all get rich together." On the 7th day after the wedding, my mom woke up. The doctor said it was a medical miracle that she regained consciousness, but I knew it had to be karma for all the good deeds she had done. 1 month later, as I walked out of the prenatal clinic, Quincy Masefield rushed over, his face full of worry. "Wife, how did it go?" I glanced at him and pointed at my belly. "The doctor says no intimacy for now." His eyes lit up momentarily, then dimmed just as quickly. He looked at my belly, his eyes full of grievance. "Wife, am I going to lose your affection?" I rolled my eyes at him, and he grinned sheepishly as he followed me, carrying my bag. As we walked, he cautiously looked after me. "Wife, slow down." Later, a video of the richest man Quincy Masefield tearfully calling me wife was posted online. It went viral, with everyone saying that the billionaire, Quincy Masefield, was afraid of his wife. Quincy Masefield's side story. I fell in love with a girl. She was the light of my 14-year-old self. When I was 14, I was kidnapped by human traffickers. In a dark cellar, I was beaten until my whole body was covered in bruises. I thought I was going to die there, but in the darkness, a small hand reached out to me. "Don't be afraid. Hang in there," a soft, young voice whispered in my ear. I looked up and saw a youthful face. Despite the bruises on her face, she forced a small smile. She said that staying alive was the most important thing. It was strange. At that moment, I was on the verge of giving up, but hearing her voice gave me the strength to keep going. She was beautiful, especially the tear mole at the corner of her eye. It was mesmerizing. She was smart and strong. She led us all in outsmarting the traffickers. Later, she helped us find the right moment and led us all to escape. I was rescued, but when I tried to find her, she was nowhere to be found. I had asked for her name. She had looked up at the stars and smiled at me. "Call me Edith Bill." Edith Bill, a name that represented hope. But I lost her. I've been searching for her ever since, but I never found any trace of her. They say I've had 9 girlfriends, none lasting more than a week, but they don't know. Those 9 girls were all victims of the same trafficking incident. I was looking for them to find out what happened to Edith Bill. Then, at a banquet, I saw a girl who bore a striking resemblance to her, Tess Bunyan. Tess Bunyan always clung to me, calling me Quincy Masefield, but I knew she wasn't her. Still, why did she look so much like Edith Bill? I had someone investigate and found out that Tess Bunyan's mother, Doris Hornby, had another daughter. She was my Edith Bill. I finally uncovered the truth of her abduction. My heart ached. My Edith Bill had suffered so much. I met Edith Bill again in the hospital. I was overjoyed. But at that moment, her face was full of sorrow. I found out that her adoptive mother had been hit by a car and was now in a coma, and the one responsible for it all was Tess Bunyan. Tess Bunyan's family had sent her abroad overnight. I knew Edith Bill wouldn't let this go, so I decided to give her a helping hand. She must have wanted to see Tess Bunyan's downfall with her own eyes. I approached her. "Do you want to be my girlfriend?" Edith Bill looked at me and then smiled. "Sure, being the billionaire's girlfriend, you won't treat me badly, right?" I knew she was only getting close to me to seek revenge for her mother, but I was still overjoyed. I also knew she hadn't recognized me. I deliberately let her see the painting in my study. She stared at it in silence for a long time. I think she recognized me then. We never spoke about it, but we both understood. She asked if I would still like her even, though she was greedy for money. How could I not? As long as it's her, no matter what, I will always love her. I was scared that once Edith Bill's revenge was complete, she would leave, but she agreed to marry me. I finally won the love of my life. Edith Bill. Quincy Maysfield says, Edith Bill, I'm so happy to have met you. You gave me the courage to live, and I hope I can give you all the happiness in the world for the rest of your life. The story ends here. Feel free to subscribe to the channel for updates and more stories uploaded daily.